There is a moment in every human life when change doesn't arrive with fireworks or force. It arrives quietly. Not with a breakdown, not with an ultimatum, but with a realization. A whisper inside that says, I can't keep living this way. And for the avoidant, that whisper is everything. You see, avoidant behavior isn't about strength, it's about survival. Somewhere along the road, this person learned that closeness meant danger, that dependence meant loss, that vulnerability meant pain. So they adapted, they became self-reliant, independent, untouchable. And for a while, that strategy worked. But strategies that protect you in one season can imprison you in another. The quiet shift begins when the avoidant realizes something profound. The walls that kept pain out are also keeping love out. And no one can force this realization. No partner, no loss, no lecture. It must come from within. This is where power is born. Because the moment an avoidant becomes aware, truly aware, that their distance is not freedom but fear, everything changes. Awareness collapses denial, and when denial falls, responsibility steps in. Not blame, responsibility. The kind that says, this is my pattern, and I can change it. Here's the truth most people never hear. Avoidants don't change because someone loves them harder. They change because staying disconnected becomes more painful than opening their heart. Pain is the great transformer. It's not punishment, it's guidance. The quiet shift happens when they feel the cost. The loneliness behind independence, the emptiness behind control, the repeated cycle of almost love, almost connection, almost fulfillment. And one day, they ask a dangerous question, what if I'm the common denominator? That question is sacred, because growth begins the moment we stop running from ourselves. Now listen closely, vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is alignment. It's the courage to let your inner world match your outer actions. And when an avoidant finally understands this, their identity begins to shift. They stop seeing closeness as a threat. They stop seeing needs as liabilities. They stop seeing love as a loss of power. And here's the divine principle. What you resist persists, but what you accept transforms. When safety is built inside, connection no longer feels dangerous. When self-worth is rooted internally, intimacy no longer feels like surrender. It feels like expansion. This is not a loud change. It's not announced. It's lived. It shows up in small choices, staying present instead of shutting down, speaking truth instead of withdrawing, choosing connection over control. These micro decisions rewire the nervous system. They create a new emotional home, and eventually love stops feeling like a battlefield and starts feeling like a place of rest. That is the quiet shift. That is the moment an avoidant stops surviving and starts living. And once that shift happens, nothing can ever be the same again. Avoidance is often misunderstood as emotional coldness, indifference, or an inability to love. But in truth, it is a deeply ingrained survival strategy formed in response to early experiences where closeness did not feel safe. At some point in life, often long before conscious memory, connection became associated with discomfort, disappointment, or emotional overwhelm. When a child learns that their needs are ignored, minimized, or punished, the nervous system adapts in the only way it knows how, by pulling inward. Detachment becomes protection. Distance becomes control. Independence becomes safety. This pattern is not chosen out of malice or selfishness. It is chosen out of necessity. The avoidant individual learns to rely on themselves because relying on others once felt dangerous or unreliable. Emotional self-sufficiency becomes a badge of honor, but underneath it lies a deep fear of being consumed, disappointed, or exposed. The heart doesn't close because it lacks feeling. It closes because it feels too much without the tools to regulate that intensity. Over time, this strategy becomes identity. The avoidant begins to believe, I'm better alone, or I don't need anyone, not realizing that these beliefs were born from adaptation, not truth. The nervous system confuses emotional distance with peace, even though true peace comes from safety, not isolation. What once protected the individual in childhood now limits their capacity for adult intimacy. Yet the pattern persists because it feels familiar, and familiarity feels safe. Avoidance is also reinforced by subtle cultural messages that praise independence while quietly shaming emotional needs. Strength is equated with self-reliance, and vulnerability is framed as weakness. Or the avoidant. These messages validate the internal narrative that closeness equals loss of control. As a result, emotions are intellectualized rather than felt. Conflicts are minimized rather than explored, and relationships are kept at arm's length to avoid the risk of dependency. The most important truth to understand is that avoidants are not unfeeling. They are highly sensitive. Their nervous systems learn to manage emotional intensity by shutting down rather than opening up. This shutdown is not the absence of emotion, it is a containment mechanism. When intimacy begins to activate old fears, the body responds before the mind has a chance to reason. Withdrawal, silence, and emotional distancing are automatic responses designed to restore a sense of safety because this pattern operates largely beneath conscious awareness. Avoidants often believe they are simply wired this way. They mistake adaptation for personality. But survival strategies are not destiny, they are response to environments that no longer exist. The fear driving avoidance is not about the present relationship. It is about the past being unconsciously replayed through the lens of the nervous system. Understanding avoidance as a learned survival strategy shifts the narrative from judgment to compassion. It allows space for growth without shame. When the avoidant begins to see their behavior not as a flaw but as a protective mechanism that once served a purpose, the door opens for change. Awareness softens resistance, and compassion creates the internal safety required for transformation to begin. Real transformation for an avoidant does not arrive through confrontation, pressure, or emotional force. In fact, the more an avoidant feels pushed to change, the deeper their defenses tend to solidify. Change that lasts is rarely loud. It does not come from ultimatums, dramatic arguments, or someone demanding emotional access. It comes from a quiet internal recalibration, a sense of safety that is built slowly, consistently, and from within. For an avoidant, the nervous system has learned that closeness equals danger. When someone demands vulnerability, the body interprets it as a threat, even if the mind understands the request is reasonable. This is why external pressure often backfires. It reinforces the very belief that intimacy is overwhelming and unsafe. True change requires a different pathway, one that soothes the nervous system rather than activating it. Internal emotional safety is the foundation of this transformation. It begins when the avoidant learns that emotions can be experienced without losing control, being engulfed, or being shamed. This safety is not provided by another person at first. It is cultivated internally. It develops through self-awareness, emotional regulation, and the slow recognition that feelings rise and fall without destroying the self. When an avoidant realizes they can sit with discomfort and survive it, the need to escape diminishes. This UE shift often starts in solitude, reflection, or moments of honest self-observation. An avoidant may notice patterns repeating, relationships ending the same way, partners expressing the same frustrations, a persistent sense of emotional emptiness despite outward independence. There is no dramatic awakening, only a subtle unease that whispers, something isn't working. That whisper becomes the seed of transformation. As internal safety grows, the avoidant begins to separate the present from the past. Emotional reactions that once felt automatic start to slow down. Instead of immediately withdrawing, there is a pause. In that pause, choice becomes possible. This is a powerful moment because it represents the reclaiming of agency. The avoidant is no longer ruled entirely by reflex. They are learning to respond rather than react. External reassurance can support this process, but it cannot replace internal security. No amount of love from another person can override a nervous system that does not feel safe within itself. When avoidants rely on others to regulate their emotions, closeness feels destabilizing. When they learn to regulate themselves, closeness becomes tolerable and eventually meaningful. Emotional safety inside creates space for emotional connection. Outside, this process also requires redefining strength. For many avoidants, strength has meant emotional restraint, self-containment, and independence at all costs. The quiet shift reframes strength as emotional presence. It teaches that staying engaged during discomfort is more powerful than retreating, that honesty is more courageous than silence, and that boundaries do not require emotional shutdown. These realizations do not arrive through lectures, they emerge through lived experience. Internal safety grows through small, consistent acts, naming emotions instead of suppressing them, allowing moments of vulnerability without self-judgment, and noticing that intimacy does not automatically lead to loss of autonomy. Each of these experiences rewires the nervous system incrementally. The body learns that connection does not have to mean danger, and the mind learns that closeness can coexist with selfhood. Because this transformation is subtle, it is often invisible to others at first. There may be no immediate change in behavior, no grand declarations of emotional availability, but internally something profound is shifting. The avoidant is learning to trust their capacity to handle emotional closeness. They are building an inner refuge where feelings can be processed rather than avoided. Over time, this internal safety begins to express itself externally. Communication becomes clearer. Withdrawal becomes less automatic. Vulnerability feels less like exposure and more like authenticity. The avoidant does not become someone else, they become more themselves, unburdened by constant self-protection. The most important truth is that transformation rooted in safety is sustainable. Change dry. Then by fear or pressure collapses under stress, but change born from internal security endures. When an avoidant learns that they are safe within their own emotional world, connection stops being a threat and starts becoming a choice. The turning point for an avoidant does not begin with changing behavior, it begins with seeing the behavior clearly. Awareness is the first fracture in the protective armor that has been built over years, sometimes decades. Until awareness arrives, avoidance feels justified, rational, even necessary. Withdrawal is framed as independence. Silence as calm, emotional distance as maturity. The pattern hides in plain sight because it has been normalized within the self. Awareness starts when the avoidant notices not just what they do, but why they do it. It is the moment they recognize that their reactions are automatic rather than chosen. They begin to see how quickly their body tightens when emotions rise, how swiftly their mind looks for escape when closeness deepens. This recognition can be uncomfortable, even unsettling, because it disrupts the identity they have relied on. But it is also liberating. You cannot change what you cannot see. This awareness is not intellectual alone, it is embodied. It shows up as a sensation in the chest when someone gets too close, a spike of irritation when needs are expressed, a sudden urge to disconnect when vulnerability is required. Instead of immediately acting on these impulses, the avoidant begins to observe them. That observation creates space. And in that space, the armor begins to loosen. Once awareness is present, responsibility inevitably follows. Responsibility does not mean self-blame or shame, it means reclaiming agency. It is the realization that while the pattern was learned, it is now being perpetuated. The avoidant begins to understand that their withdrawal affects others, that their silence communicates something even when no words are spoken. This realization can be painful, but and here is not destructive, it is instructive. Responsibility is the moment power returns to the self. When the avoidant accepts that they are participating in the pattern, they also accept that they have the capacity to alter it. This is a profound shift. Instead of viewing emotional triggers as something others cause, they begin to see them as internal signals calling for attention. The external world stops being the enemy, and the inner world becomes the focus. Taking responsibility also means letting go of the fantasy that the right partner or the right circumstances will fix everything. Awareness reveals that the same issues would emerge regardless of who is present, because the pattern lives inside the nervous system. This understanding dismantles avoidance's favorite defense, projection. When responsibility is embraced, excuses lose their grip. This phase often brings grief. Grief for missed connections, for relationships that could not deepen, for moments where distance replaced. Intimacy. This grief is not a setback, it is evidence of emotional awakening. It means the avoidant is no longer numb to the cost of their defenses. They are beginning to feel what was previously shut down. With responsibility comes intentional choice. The avoidant starts to recognize the split second where they usually withdraw, and instead of disappearing, they stay. Not perfectly, not every time, but intentionally. This is where growth becomes active, rather than theoretical. Responsibility transforms awareness into action, even when the action is small. This process requires humility. It asks the avoidant to accept that being self-sufficient did not make them invulnerable, it made them isolated. It invites them to redefine control, not as emotional distance, but as the ability to remain present in discomfort. Responsibility does not strip away autonomy. It restores it by replacing reflex with choice. As awareness deepens and responsibility strengthens, the avoidance relationship with themselves changes. They stop seeing their emotional responses as flaws to eliminate and start seeing them as information to understand. This self-attunement creates internal trust, and when a person trusts themselves to handle emotions, they no longer need armor to survive them. The armor does not fall off all at once. It cracks gradually, piece by piece. But once awareness has pierced it and responsibility has been claimed, the process is irreversible. The avoidant cannot unsee what they now know. They have crossed a threshold where unconscious patterns begin to lose authority, and conscious presence begins to take its place. Avoidants rarely change because someone asks them to, pleads with them, or loves them harder. Change does not happen when the fear of vulnerability is merely exposed. It happens when the pain of staying the same becomes impossible to ignore. As long as avoidance feels safer than connection, the pattern remains intact. Fear keeps the system closed. But pain, honorable, accumulated undeniable pain forces a reckoning. For a long time, avoidance appears to work. Emotional distance prevents conflict, minimizes dependency, and preserves a sense of control. The avoidant tells themselves they are fine, independent, unaffected. But beneath this surface stability, a quieter pain grows. It shows up as emotional emptiness, repeated relationship failures, or a lingering sense that something meaningful is always just out of reach. This pain is subtle at first, easy to dismiss, but it accumulates. Over time, the avoidant begins to notice patterns they can no longer rationalize away. Relationships end not because of incompatibility, but because of emotional unavailability. Partners express the same frustrations. Intimacy consistently stalls at the same depth. What once felt like freedom starts to feel like isolation. The cost of avoidance becomes visible, not all at once, but gradually, relentlessly. This is where the internal balance shifts. The fear of vulnerability is still present, but now it has competition. The pain of disconnection begins to outweigh the fear of closeness. Loneliness becomes heavier than anxiety. Regret becomes louder than self-protection. This is the tipping point. Growth begins not when fear disappears, but when it is no longer the dominant force. Pain serves a purpose here. It acts as feedback, revealing that the current strategy is no longer serving the individual's deeper needs. The avoidant may feel restless, dissatisfied, or emotionally stuck. They may question why achievements, independence, or self-control no longer bring fulfillment. This questioning is not weakness, it is awakening. At this stage, avoidance starts to feel like self-betrayal. The avoidant realizes that by protecting themselves from potential hurt, they are also denying themselves genuine connection. The fear that once promised safety now delivers stagnation. This realization is uncomfortable because it challenges the identity built around sufficiency. But it is also empowering because it reveals choice. The pain of staying the same often intensifies through loss. This loss is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, a relationship that fades, a moment of connection that never deepens, a sense of being emotionally unseen even when surrounded by people. These experiences accumulate until the avoidant can no longer ignore the emotional cost of their defenses. Importantly, this pain does not immediately produce change. First, it produces awareness, then resistance, then grief. The avoidant may mourn the years spent disconnected, the relationships that never fully bloomed. This grief is essential. It signals that emotional capacity is returning. Numbness gives way to feeling, and feeling, even painful feeling, is movement. Eventually, the avoidant faces a choice: continue protecting themselves at the expense of intimacy, or risk vulnerability in pursuit of something more fulfilling. This choice is not made lightly. Vulnerability still feels dangerous, but now staying closed feels worse. The nervous system begins to tolerate discomfort because the alternative, emotional isolation, has become unbearable. This is when courage quietly emerges. Not the loud kind, but the steady willingness to stay present when fear arises. The avoidant begins to test new behaviors, expressing a need, staying during conflict, allowing themselves to be seen. Each act of vulnerability is fueled not by confidence but by necessity. The pain of avoidance has made growth non-negotiable. Change driven by this internal pressure is authentic and lasting. It is not performative or temporary. When an avoidant reaches this point, they are no longer changing to please someone else, they are changing to reclaim their own emotional life. The fear of vulnerability does not vanish, but it loses its authority. Pain has rewritten the hierarchy, and connection finally becomes worth the risk. Love becomes possible for an avoidant when there is a fundamental shift in identity, not just behavior. For much of their life, the avoidant has lived from an internal narrative that says, "I must protect myself to survive." This belief is not conscious, but it governs choices, reactions, and emotional boundaries. It frames closeness as a threat and independence as safety. As long as this identity remains intact, intimacy will always feel risky, no matter how healthy the partner or relationship may be. The shift begins when the avoidant slowly realizes that protection is no longer the same as safety. Protection is defensive. It is rooted in fear. Safety, on the other hand, is internal and grounded. When identity starts to move from self-protection toward self-trust, the entire emotional landscape changes. The avoidant begins to sense that they are not as fragile as they once believed. Emotions may be intense, but they are survivable. Vulnerability may be uncomfortable, but it is not catastrophic. This identity shift is subtle and deeply personal. It does not happen because someone convinces the avoidant that love is safe. It happens when the avoidant learns, through experience, that they can remain whole then when emotionally exposed. Each time they express a feeling and are not destroyed by it, each time they stay present during discomfort and nothing terrible happens, the old identity loosens its grip. The nervous system starts to update its assumptions about danger. As the belief I must protect myself weakens, a new belief begins to form: I am safe to connect. This does not mean that fear disappears. It means fear no longer defines the self. The avoidant starts to trust their capacity to set boundaries without shutting down, to say no without withdrawing, and to stay engaged without losing autonomy. Safety is no longer outsourced to distance, it is generated from within. This internal safety allows love to be experienced differently. Instead of feeling like an intrusion, closeness begins to feel stabilizing. Instead of feeling like a loss of control, intimacy becomes a shared space where individuality is preserved. The avoidant realizes that connection does not require self-erasure. They can be close and still be themselves. This realization is revolutionary because it directly challenges the core fear that intimacy demands sacrifice of identity. As identity shifts, emotional needs are no longer seen as weaknesses. The avoidant begins to recognize that needing connection does not make them dependent or powerless. It makes them human. They start to allow themselves to receive care without suspicion and offer vulnerability without feeling exposed. Love becomes a choice rather than a threat, something entered into freely rather than resisted reflexively. This transformation also changes how the avoidant relates to others' needs. Instead of perceiving them as demands or pressures, they begin to see them as invitations to connect. The impulse to withdraw softens, replaced by curiosity and presence. The avoidant does not become emotionally expansive overnight, but they become emotionally available in ways that were previously impossible. Importantly, this shift is anchored in self-trust. The avoidant learns that they can leave a situation if it becomes unhealthy, that they can speak up if something feels wrong, and that they do not have to disappear to stay safe. This trust eliminates the need for constant vigilance. Love no longer feels like walking into a trap, it feels like stepping into a shared experience. As the identity self-protection dissolves, the avoidant discovers something unexpected. Connection does not weaken them, it strengthens them. Being seen does not diminish their power, it deepens it. Love becomes a space where growth happens rather than something that must be survived. And when this identity shift takes root, love is no longer avoided. It is finally allowed. Thank you for giving your time and heart to this message. May it spark clarity, courage, and quiet transformation within you. Goodbye for now, but remember, the moment you choose awareness over fear, your life will never be the same.